Dear friends, we are discussing Science as Falsification by Karl Popper. In the previous lecture, I told you that he was concerned with the problem of demarcation. That is, what is for him is the problem of demarcation? How to distinguish science from non-science or pseudoscience. How to distinguish a scientific theory from a non-scientific theory. Now, I told you that he felt Einstein's theory of gravitation as a scientific theory because it could be disproved, it had a scope, it provided a scope to refute it, to falsify it. That is, if the Eddington experiment had gone wrong, the theory could have been refuted or falsified. For him, that is a very strong criterion for deciding a scientific theory. That is, a scientific theory is one which can be falsified, not which can be verified. You see, we already know that this man, Karl Popper, was a logicist, was a logician. So, he was applying logic to understand the nature of scientific theories. We have already discussed that he felt Marxian theory is non-scientific. He already expressed his disappointment at the pseudoscience nature or of Marx's historical materialism. He was not at all happy with Adlerian explanation of theory of inferiority complex. He also was exposed to the theory of psychoanalysis of id, ego and superego of one of the greatest psychologists of all time, Sigmund Freud. But he felt this is very significant. Whatever Sigmund Freud says makes sense, probably it is true, but it cannot be considered as a scientific theory. It is not in testable form. It can be easily falsified. It cannot be falsified. It cannot be refuted. Now, I'll just give a short introduction to Sigmund Freud's theory of id, ego and superego so that we know why it cannot be falsified. Now, very briefly, Sigmund Freud argues that our mind has three sides: id, ego, superego. Id is the internal drive, the impulsive part of our personality, which also constitutes sexual, biological urges. It is egocentric, it is selfish, it just wants to do whatever it desires. Right, but that is always controlled, regulated, rationalized by ego part of our personality, which is not to be confused with the dictionary definition of ego. It always rationalizes id through control, through denial, through judgment. Then comes the superego, which is the moral component of our mind. There is a conscience. This is not supposed to be done. This is not, we are not expected to do this. When we say that, basically we mean that we are talking about the influence of the value structure, influence of religious customs, the norms on our day-to-day life, social norms, things that we are not supposed to do, not expected to do. This is the, because this the moral part of our mind. Now this is fine, we understand. Popper says we understand. It has some implications for human behavior, this theorization. But how do we test it? It is not in testable form. If it is not in testable form, and then how will you prove that this is a scientific theory? A scientific theory should be falsifiable. This theory that mind has three sides to it. One side is egocentric, impulsive, has biological urge. The other side is trying to control that, and the third side has the moral component, which adhere to the societal norms and values. How are we going to prove or disprove it? This is completely non-falsifiable, and anything which is non-falsifiable for Popper, that is not a theory. Now let us look at the principles of falsification as stated by Karl Popper. The first thing that he says is it's very easy to find confirmation of a theory if you are looking for one. If you are looking for confirmation, if you are looking for verification, you will always get it. Let us think of Karl Marx's theory. Now, Popper says the original theory of Karl Marx had certain risky propositions which could have been easily falsified, and that would have made it a very sound theory. But the later Marxists, they started adding auxiliary statements they started adding clauses to the original theory to make it foolproof, and that is what not a scientific theory according to Popper, because it cannot be falsifiable. Now he says, when you open the newspaper, every news event, Marxists would say, can be explained within the Marxist framework. There is no chance. The later Marxists do not give any chance for others, for other academicians to falsify Marxism. They do not give any chance for others to say that, see, Marxism doesn't work here, Marxism fails here. Everywhere they would provide certain confirmation, certain verification of Marxist theory. For Karl Popper, that doesn't constitute a sound scientific theory, because it cannot be falsifiable. If you are looking for confirmation, you will always get it. You will always find a way to confirm a theory, to verify a theory. Remember one of the statements I wrote on the blackboard? All swans are white except those found in Australia. That is non-falsifiable. Why? Because you have already added that auxiliary statement, that clause, except those found in Australia, all the swans are white. Hence, you cannot falsify that. Karl Popper had a problem with that, with such kind of statements, such kind of formulations, such kind of theorization. Second, confirmation should count if it is the result of risky prediction. That is, it must provide an instance or occurrence or an event which can be falsifiable or which can be refutable. Example, Einstein's theory of gravitation. He says, it is the result of a risky prediction that the light gets attracted by heavier bodies, and hence the distance, the original location of the stars appears shifted. They look distant, further distant from sun. All this could have been rejected, falsified easily, but it got corroborated. He says that risky prediction makes a theory a sound, strong scientific theory. Every good scientific theory is a prohibition. It forbids things to happen. The more a theory forbids, the better it is. It must have something which can be easily falsifiable, which can be refuted. And if you can refute a theory, it is a sound scientific theory according to Popper. See, his logic is very simple. He says it is absolutely impossible to verify each and every aspect of a theory. It's very difficult to find verification, confirmation for each and every instance of a theory, but it is absolutely logically possible to produce one counter instance, a counter instance which would go on to falsify the theory. So that is simply the logic that he adopts. It's impossible to verify every aspect of a theory, but it is easy, it is quite possible, logically possible to reject it by one counter instance, by one counter observation. Hence, why not take falsifiability as a criteria to decide the scientific status of a theory? Why take verification as the scientific status of a theory? Generally, we verify things, we do experiment, and that experiment is tested through verification. Once we verify, then we say that this is our theory. He says, no, let us make falsification as a criteria to decide the scientific status of a theory, because it is impossible logically to verify each and every aspect of a theory, but it is completely logically possible to produce one counter instance which would negate the theory, which would falsify the theory. Let us use falsification as a criterion for selecting or deciding a theory to be scientific. So for him, any theory which is not refutable by any conceivable event is non-scientific. Irrefutability for him is not a virtue of the theory, as people often think, but a vice. That is, if a theory cannot be rejected, cannot be refuted, it cannot be considered as a good theory. It is not its strength, but it is its weakness. A theory which cannot be rejected is not its strength, but it is a weakness of the theory. That is how Popper logically argues. Every genuine test of a theory is an attempt to falsify it or to refute it. For him, testability is falsifiability. Testability is not through verification. You do not test a theory through verification, you test a theory through falsification. For him, conforming evidence should not count when it is the result of a genuine test of a theory. This means that it can only count as a serious but unsuccessful attempt to falsify a theory. So when you are looking for confirmation, it should not count to as a theory to be proved as correct. Rather, it should be considered as a serious but unsuccessful attempt to falsify a theory. If a theory does not get falsified, then what happens? Popper says it's okay. That means the theory is fitter. He uses analogy from Darwinian biology, that he says the theory is fitter, it can survive for a longer period. It does not mean that it is the best theory or a good theory, is that it can fit better to the existing data set. But sooner or later it has to be falsified for science to progress, because once a theory is falsified, then we have a problem situation. Then that problem situation would lead to another theory, and that another theory would be falsified. Then again a new theory would emerge. For him, scientific theories evolve. It is a evolutionary model, unlike Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn was talking about non-linear progress of science. The science does not progress in a linear order, doesn't progress cumulatively. It is through disjunction, it is through breaks, it is through break in continuity in the form of a revolution, right? But Popper says theory evolve. Scientific progress is evolutionary in nature. One scientific theory gets falsified, then it leads to another problem situation that gets falsified. Then that is how science develops, that is how science progresses. So falsification is the only form of testability of scientific theory. But if a theory doesn't get falsified, it's just that it is better fit. It can survive for slightly longer period of time. But sooner or later, it is bound to be falsified, and then a new theory would emerge. Now, he definitely did not like the idea of adding ad hoc auxiliary assumption, ad hoc auxiliary statement to make a theory foolproof. Example, I have already told you about. There are all the swans are white except those found in Australia, which are green or black. Now this is the clause of adding a green swan to the statement is an auxiliary ad hoc statement which scientists make use of to make the theory foolproof. Think of Karl Marx, the Marxist who interpret Marxist theory, and they prove that Marxist theory holds true in any situation by adding such ad hoc statements. Now we will look at what are these ad hoc statements, how he was not in favor of any theory which could explain everything and which could not be falsified at all. We will see that, but before that, when we talk about this ad hoc auxiliary statements, he has a term for that, he has a jargon for that. He calls such rescue operation of adding a ad hoc statement to make the theory foolproof as conventionalist twist or conventionalist stratagem. That is, the theorists, they try to make their theory foolproof by adding certain clauses to it. Like for instance, think of that statement: for metal there is a temperature at which it melts. For every metal there is a temperature at which it melts. It cannot be falsified. And for Popper, that is logically unsound, logically incorrect. If a theory cannot be falsified, then that's not a good theory, because for him the simple logic is that it is absolutely possible to reject a theory. one counter instance can reject a theory, but it is not possible to confirm, to find evidence to prove every theory. So why not take falsification as a criterion? We have already discussed about Adler and his theory of inferiority complex. Now let us look at these two statements. If you look at those two statements, in the first case, a man pushes a child to water to drown. In another situation, man diving inside the water to rescue a child. Now, Popper argues that if it were Freud, he would have argued both this completely opposite, diametrically opposite phenomenon with his single theory of repression and sublimation. What is repression? In Freudian theory, repression is the behavior of human being under the influence of superego, which forces him or her to antisocial or destructive activities. So, under the influence, it is the psychological mechanism of repression which works when a child is pushed into water by a person. But when a person is diving inside the water to save the child, it is sublimation. And what is sublimation according to Freud? Sublimation is when our our emotions, our sexual energy, our erotic energy is channelized into artistic pursuit, literary pursuit, to do something constructive. So when a person dives inside water to save a child, it is the sublimation, the working of the sublimation of human mind that is working, right? So Popper says this is wrong. You are explaining two very different phenomenon, two opposite phenomenon with the help of a single theory of repression and sublimation. Same holds true for Adler and his theory of inferiority complex. Why a person is pushing a child into water to drown is because a person has tremendous inferiority complex. He wants to prove to himself that he can dare to push a child into water. And why a person is rescuing the child from water is because of the same inferiority complex which is at play, which is at work now. The person wants to prove to others that he has the guts, he has the courage to save a child from water. Again, two very different phenomenon being explained by one single theory. He says this kind of approach is this kind of approach cannot constitute a theory. A theory which cannot be falsified is not a theory at all. He has a problem with Marxian theory, he has a problem with Adlerian theory, he has a problem with Freud's theory, but he is okay with Einstein's theory. Now, it does not mean that Einstein's theory fall into the natural sciences, hence it is considered as a sound scientific theory by him, and that this theories fall into the domain of humanities or social sciences, hence these theories are rejected by Popper. Popper does not look at the disciplinary background of the theories. What he looks at is whether a theory is a scientific theory or not. For him, a theory can be a scientific theory if it can be falsifiable, not if it can be verifiable. That is a simple logic, because he feels that a theory, it is impossible to find confirmation, to verify every aspect of a theory, but it is logically possible to produce one counter instance which will reject the theory, which would refute the theory. Hence, testability should be falsifiability. Testability should not be verifiability. Finally, as I have already explained, for Popper, the theory advances, scientific theory advances in evolutionary fashion. For him, it is not revolutionary, like Thomas Kuhn argued. For him, one theory gets rejected, gets falsified, then we have a problem situation 2, then that problem situation 2 leads to certain error elimination. Error elimination is nothing but falsification, then it leads to problem situation theory, problem situation 3, and that is how science advances, right? I will just put it in the form of an equation. So finally, this is how the evolutionary structure of science of falsification of Karl Popper can be presented. PS1 is problem situation 1, which leads to certain development of tentative theories. Then this will be subject to rigorous testability in the form of error elimination, which is basically the falsification or refutability of the tentative theories. Then that will lead to problem situation 2, and then again this is how the science grows, science advances. One theory getting rejected, then then it leads to another theory, right? But if certain theories survives the falsification, as I told you earlier, is because it can better survive the process of refutation, but it doesn't mean that it is truer, rather it is fitter, that is more applicable to the problem situation at hand. Consequently, just as species biologically fit does not predict continued survival, neither does rigorous testing protect a scientific theory from refutation in the future. Any theory would be ultimately refuted or falsified according to Popper, and this is how the scientific knowledge advances towards greater problems. So here I end the discussion on Karl Popper's science and falsification. Thank you.